Hi, everybody. Today I'm excited to talk with Chloe Barreau. Chloe has been living at the intersection of design, technology, and AI for some time and sharing a lot of her work and learnings publicly. In this fun and visually interactive chat, we're going to talk about how AI has changed and will change how we create visual content, how it applies to user interfaces, and how a lot of our creative roles will need to adapt. This can be a fun one, so let's get started. Chloe, it's absolutely great to chat with
Hey.
you. And we're going to be having this in a pretty virtual environment and doing all kinds of interactive things on screen. So it's a whole new format. So I'm excited to try this out and to learn more about you and your interests and how you got started in all the fun things that you do. So before we go on, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Chloe. I kind of have a hard time categorizing myself into any one thing. I'd say I'm a designer, engineer, also a product person, just very interdisciplinary by nature. I'm currently wrapping up my master's at Stanford, and very interested in the intersection of computer science and art.
Really cool. So right now I'm currently looking at what looks like a portfolio of various things you worked on. Can you walk
Yeah.
me through what the
Yeah, I figured it'd be helpful to just share some of the tools that I've used over time for on the design side, which is something that I've been doing since 2018, UI UX design. It started off with Sketch, Figma, and Vision, and now my workflow incorporates things like Midjourney. And so I included some screenshots as well. I think in the last year, I've been amazed by the number of tools that can use a form of engineering in the art practice, whether that's Midjourney, using a pen plotter, or doing things with more graphics like in Blender.
So before we go even there, let's go all the way back. What got you interested in computers and in UI and engineering and all these fun topics?
Yeah, I think it's being able to build something, like feel like you're making something from scratch. You also get that with making art, right? Like you take a crayon and paper, and as soon as you make a mark, you see visualized on a screen what you've done. And I feel similarly with web development and just computer science. You're really making something from the ground up. And I think that's what's always attracted me. But even more so, technology's impact on people, because a lot of people now have cell phones. You can make something that becomes accessible to a lot of people. And that's really exciting to me as well.
What was the first thing you ever remember creating?
Oof. Creating in general, well, I mean, I started with little clay figurines, to be honest, in terms of art. In terms of like technical stuff, I made a website to sell my jewelry, and that was using PayPal, and really janky website basics.
That's actually quite pretty cool. Were you using a platform like Shopify or Etsy, or were you building it entirely on your own and
Well,
just integrating with PayPal at the end?
yeah, it was just me and my sister doing it like bare bones, and then something called Store Envy existed at the time, where I then hosted my products, like, basically the equivalent of Shopify or Etsy.
So I'm looking at the screen and I see what looks like a plotting device, like a mechanical plotting device. Can you tell me more about what's going on here?
Yeah, it's a pen plotter, and this specific one is called the AxiDraw, and it's a machine that draws for you. So, in the world of automation, instead of you having to go and use your bare hands to grab a pastel or a pen to make a mark, it will actually take your instructions and do that for you.
That's really cool. So you're saying you're currently studying HCI or human computer interaction, correct? Okay.
Correct.
When I took, I did not major in HCI, I majored in computer science, but when I took a few classes in that area because my hobby and interests were always around the intersection between development, engineering, and UI development, it was very different back then. We used Java, we used Swing. This was like 2006, so it was like quite a while ago at MIT, the Media Lab. And the thing we were always focusing on was like, the basics of all the various techniques on how to make sure the UI is discoverable, how to make this work in a nice way.
Hmm.
And over the years, though, the entire discipline seems to have gotten much more formalized. There's a lot more resources, a lot more just general knowledge on what to do here. But AI has also changed a whole lot of it as well, because nowadays I look at it and I go, I used to have to build a web page. by learning HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and a framework. Now I just jump into Framer or Webflow, and all of these have like really nice tools to generate content for me. I think Canva does a lot of good things in this area as well. So I'm curious to know, like, you're studying at right this intersection where a year ago half these things that exist, and right now a lot of things exist, and by the time you graduate, more things will exist as well. How have you been able to, like, navigate through this massive amount of change, especially in the field that you're currently studying in?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right that prototyping has become much easier, and so I think when that happens, you start thinking about higher level questions of how like people interact with screens and systems, which is cool. And you're also right that there's been a lot of change. I mean, every month or so there's something new that comes out, and I think my approach has been try to use it whenever I can. So when I'm designing something, when I'm implementing something, I go to ChatGPT or Midjourney to see how it can help me, and kind of build off of its first draft. And it's been surprisingly effective. I mean, for Midjourney, I wouldn't say it produces like a polished output, but it's been really helpful in helping me generate ideas and brainstorm along the way. Um, yeah, I think whenever I can, I try to see how far it can get me, and then I fill in the rest that AI can't.
And the part you're filling in, I think, is like the magic secret sauce that a human being can provide that an AI might not be able to. Do you feel that at some point, those gaps that humans need to be intervening will also be replaced where AI ends up, solving it in a nice way?
I mean, we're trying to do that, right? Like, we're trying to have multiple AI agents to give feedback to each other and kind of help each other fill in. But I don't think it's ever perfect, especially since AI has difficulty with context. And I think that can be really helpful for a human to be in the loop and to create, I guess, what people call alignment or just more feedback. So I don't think it's like 100% replaceable, but I do think there's a lot of really cool work being done to minimize how much we actually need to weigh in as humans.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And because I always look back at the levels of abstractions that have been added even before AI existed. The way the tools we use back then, at least I never had to use it, but I see examples of like latex being a syntax for marking up documents for various
Mm,
activities. Now we just use either Microsoft Word or Google Docs, and we just write naturally the way we think we should write. And
yeah.
behind the scenes, I'm sure the representation is horrifically complex, but we don't worry about it anymore. I sometimes do think that AI might fill in that same kind of a bucket where we'll be working on more higher order things and not worrying about the basic areas of creation. But the thing I also worry about is I'm a product manager. I see what ChatGPT can create for common questions and situations based on past knowledge because, for the most part, none of us are like trying to build rockets to go out in outer space. We're just solving existing problems in a
Yeah.
new contextual way, which unfortunately is something that AI is fantastic at. And so, have you ever run into those kind of situations where you're like, will my skill set even be valuable, a year, 2 or 3 years from now?
Uh, I I'm not as scared as maybe most, and maybe this makes me like a tech optimist. I don't know, but when I see the output from something like ChatGPT or even Midjourney, like you can tell. I mean, I can recognize it for Midjourney for sure. For ChatGPT, it's a little harder, and I think it's because it takes so much of like past data that it becomes just very stereotypical. And I think where we as individuals can be helpful is we each have our unique perspectives, a lot of subjective aesthetics and opinions on how text and tone should exist. And so that specificity really helps. And I think that's where I continue to um, find myself valuable in the process. I'll kind of stray it into more of a niche than it's currently doing.
So you mentioned Midjourney. Should I go to the Midjourney section in the Figma file?
Sure, yeah. And actually, we can go to the AI tools section because I think
Okay,
it would
let's
be
go there.
cool for people to
AI
see.
tools. Right.
Yeah, I don't know if I should assume that people know what Midjourney is, but so I'll just briefly describe. It's similar to Dolly, if people are familiar with OpenAI's Dolly. It allows you to take a piece of text and translate it into an image using AI. And Midjourney is specifically for visuals. They don't do text to text, at least for now. And a lot of artists and creative people have been interfacing with Midjourney, which exists on Discord, because of just how much it can help with the creative process. And so I have an
Gotcha.
example of that here. Yeah.
Yeah. So here you are describing in fairly good detail a soda can, and then describing all the various levels of output you want the system to create, and it created essentially four variations.
Yeah, and I think this is where you kind of see the progression of trying to understand and wrangle these AI tools. At first, I started off with just like a simple sentence that I thought was descriptive, and then I realized that people are putting in so much like detail and nuance in these prompts to try and bring more life to the image. And so then I started doing the same, and you can see it's like almost a paragraph of descriptions that aren't exactly coherent, they're really just words strung together. To try and enhance the prompt. And I think what's interesting for me to see now is that sometimes that's not sufficient. Like looking at these images, they're okay knowing that they're made by AI, but they're not something I would actually put out in the world. And what has helped is using reference images, which if you go to the right, I provided one, and
Yeah.
that, to me at least, looks so much better. So what I'm doing here is providing a image that I think, I as a human think is what I'm going for, and then adding a really like simple sentence to give it a little more guidance. And it's just so much better than having spent a time writing an entire paragraph. So it's stuff like that where you just like learn how to get what you want with the AI tool over time just by trial and error.
It's almost as if we replaced traditional programming with English language, where prompt engineering and like designing the input that go into it is going to become in its own way a very, like lucrative and like, educational environment for people who learn programming.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's like exactly the same as programming, but it's definitely a new skill, and I think a lot of it is experimentation and observational rather than pure logic, which I find super interesting because I like working in those gray areas.
Absolutely. I've seen some like a lot of proposals for new schemas for making the prompts more formalized in terms of like what the output can be. And it looks like a combination of like XML and JSON, but it was very interesting to see like the specs being created, at least for, I think I've seen it for like ChatGPT, where there's like a very formal structure for defining the input. And that to me looked, pretty comprehensive and also a little bit more of like, okay, I learned one more thing here, which is exciting actually. And I love learning new things here. So I've been fiddling with that. And this seems much more natural though. I'd rather describe it in English, just like another human being. If I was conversing with that person, well, how would I describe it? This just feels like more appropriate.
Yeah, it does feel more appropriate. I think an interesting HCI question though is also like expectations versus reality, right? Like when you start getting people to use just natural language, they're going to start talking to the machine as if it actually is a person. And there are a lot of things that the machine won't actually understand that you think it does as a result of having a human language interface rather than something a little bit more constrained.
Yeah, there's always this expectation of talking to a real human being that I might have said 80 words, of which only 50 might actually be the real thing I'm actually looking for. The other 30 might be, just context, but not really important. The machine, at least as of right now, may not know that. So I might say, like, casually mention, like, I need to have like a reflective background. And you're like, no, he's kidding. There's no way it was a reflective background. But the system would be like, oh, reflective background. Check. Let me go ahead and create a reflective background. So it's going to be a little bit more of like, this behavioral change in how we start expressing our ideas.
For sure. Yeah. And I'm excited for that to evolve. I mean, right now, Midjourney is all text based. And I think the ways that we express our ideas, especially for visual images, is visual. It's not in text. And so if we can get to a point where we're like sketching ideas and using like basic sketches to guide the output, that would really be cool. And I mean, that people are working on it. Midjourney is going to work on it. But yeah, I think that's the next phase.
The exciting part also is that I grew up in a world where there wasn't Facebook or Twitter just yet. Just as I was like, entering into like high school, I saw like, like Twitter was just starting to become more popular. And then there are a lot of studies that I've been reading over the years. I can't pinpoint any exact one, but the often said that because of the influence of social media, Facebook, Twitter, and all these things, people's behaviors have changed to a certain extent as well. Like the things
Mm.
that they do and say in their a typical day, there's more things that they're doing that's different than what they've done in a world where these things do not exist. And I often wonder because let's say that we all become, really good at defining prompts in a way that computers can really understand. And so you start thinking about problems in terms of like, okay, if I had to give this to a computer, how would I translate it into all these, finite steps? would that end up changing how you and I would end up conversing at some point? Because in my mind, I'm like so trained to automatically jump to prompts as a way of like expressing what I'm trying to do. And then will we all start changing our talking style? Like, will words we use be different? Will our tone be different? Spacing? That's what I'm actually really curious about when this becomes really popular. How much will our own behavior have changed?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think social media has changed our behavior, and using a lot of AI tools certainly will as well. But it's hard to extrapolate because I think the AI tools are changing so quickly. I don't actually know what format will stick. If it ends up being very similar to ChatGPT, then maybe our communication will get more concise and literal. Maybe that will be an outcome. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole purpose of HCI, right? The belief that humans' interactions with technology will change technology and vice versa. Let me take a second to remove my email tab so that it's not making sounds in the background.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I did not hear any of it. So kudos to the echo cancellation and noise cancellation that
Oh,
Riverside
awesome.
might be
Yeah.
having. I'm sure it's AI powered in some sense as well, which, I
Oh,
mean, things like everything's called AI these days, when the reality is that it's just, simple pattern matching, which has always existed for a very, very long time. So it's a buzzword.
yeah. I mean, that's the other thing, right? Like AI is kind of making guesses at what to add and what to remove. And I think it's a helpful skill for humans to know when AI might do that, right? Like, so for audio, we might assume, okay, it's going to remove some background noise, and that's an understanding. But when technology moves so fast, sometimes it's removing or adding things that humans aren't generally cognizant of. And I think that's where it gets scary.
Absolutely. I was reading this article on AI tools that historically retouch photos from like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and so on. And a lot of the criticism is that no one really exactly knows what the exact colors were used and things like that. And what the AI is ultimately creating is
Mm.
almost in ways recreating what history might have been, because it gives you eight variations and you have to pick and choose, is this the right color? I'm like, well, I mean, I want to choose what makes the most sense to me looking at the context of 2023. This seems like what might appropriately be it. And of course, we have some general idea of like, brick must probably be in the color of a brick, and the edges must probably be like, brick, cement, brick, and all these things. But it then it loses the authenticity in some cases as well.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about when is it okay for something to look broken, right? And for something to visually admit that it's not there, or there isn't confidence in what to display. I think right now we're operating in, okay, can we productize all these images? Can we like make all of these technologies practical? And so we err on just guessing the color of the image, filling it in, but maybe it's okay for there to be gaps and to kind of visually show how the system doesn't know something.
Which is always funny because when you study history, oftentimes they talk about like how our perceptions of history are often viewed through the lens of our present way of interpreting various events. I think it's called like historiography or something like that. I could be wrong about the word, but when someone looks at a situation in the 1800s of like what happened in, let's say, the 1600, their interpretation of it would be very different than us looking at it right now. And so some of the common feedback you get is, these AI photos that are coming in, it's natural because our interpretation will always be changing, and this is it might actually be accurate because for our current moment in time, this is how history and our understanding of the world has always been. It's always viewed through the lens of what we just learned and how our perception is. So it's always funny seeing all these things.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know about you, but I don't know how many people are actually aware of like what a what mid journey is and what a mid journey image looks like. So there's also, uh, I think, who sees the AI art or tools that you create is important, because the average person may look at a warpy mid journey image and have a very different takeaway from someone like myself or yourself who's a bit familiar with what's going on.
Yeah, I think we're on the cutting edge here. We're basically right at almost the ground floor, trying out all of these various things and learning what's going to happen. I think a lot of these services will ultimately be made more readily available in more common things that people use on a day-to-day basis. Like we're seeing how like both the Google search engine and the Bing search engine are going to be adding AI prompts and generating visuals naturally
Yep.
as a part of their daily activity, that's going to reach a lot more people because most people, like you mentioned, you're right, they probably don't know about Midjourney or ChatGPT or Stable Diffusion or what the difference in all these things are, but they probably do go to Google and type in a question about like find me the best pizza in this location, and they may end up benefiting from the results of all the things we're doing right now being returned for them. And it could even be they ask a question of like, how do I get from point A to point B? There may be sequences of the journey where it's generated by AI because actual photos don't exist, but we have enough context that's available, and you'll never know, what is AI and what isn't.
Yeah, or maybe we'll know what's AI and what isn't if HCI does its job well. But yeah, I think that
Exactly.
it is exciting for all this to become more just commonly used. And because it's so cutting edge, we're trying to like reimagine what these interfaces look like.
It's almost like CGI in movies. It was one of those things where back long time ago, the techniques for doing CGI were very primitive. I think that's like I forget, like Wizard of Oz or something, where they talked about how like I forget one of the characters. It's where the show, it was like blue and like the face morphed. It was actually because they used a different lens on the camera that optimized for blue in one scene and red in the other, so it made it look like the face was morphing, and that was the technology back then. Whereas today, of course, it's all done on the computer. You watch any modern film, it's often hard to tell what is real and what is green screen and what is actually done, by clever visual tricks. And I do worry sometimes that we may get into that world where it looks real, sounds real, and it may also be just, to us, our perception is like, yeah, it is real.
Yeah, yeah, it could just be the accepted reality. Mm.
But no, the thing that always excites me about this is that every time that new technology comes in, there's this generation of people who are like, a little worried. They always are like, oh no, this is going to take what I'm doing. And the term is like creative destruction. The idea is that as technology, moves forward, as things happen, people will find more higher level pursuits to follow
Mm.
as opposed to doing what they've done before. We saw that with like the rise of Photoshop on illustrators. Someone I spoke to recently used to design billboards for a living in the 80s. And once the digital, tools became really popular, he transitioned to learning digital tools and became very successful doing like film intros and so on. So, I do think this is an exception. I think a lot of people end up, doing something very different. And I'd be curious to see like how all of this changes, essentially what, you will be doing, in the future in your career, and how what I will be doing as I'm currently doing it now, how that will evolve as well.
For sure. We'll have a check in a couple years from now.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So I'm looking at some of the other parts in the Figma document. Anywhere else I should go to continue this conversation?
Oh, there are a bunch of parts.
Yeah.
Zoom out a bit.
Yep. Zoomed out.
Cool. Oh, okay, yeah, we can talk about like what it means for these tools to become just like common knowledge, commonly accessed.
Okay.
In the case of art. So up there actually, yeah, where it says the hand versus the machine or machine versus hand.
Yeah. Let me zoom in here.
Um, I think it's exciting for people to see that there are a lot of people working with technology and art and making really cool stuff. None of the so what you're seeing here, those are not mine. That's from the Generative Art Club. It's a community on Slack of I think around 500 people right now, using technology to create beautiful pieces. And I've started working in those mediums too, which if you scroll down, you'll also see. Um, and I think what comes through to me is that people's styles and their sensibilities do translate in the machine. I think oftentimes people wonder if you're using AI tools, if you're using technology, does that mean that the artist is kind of just gone and it's the machine doing all the work? Like we should give the machine all the credit. And I think when you see all these different styles of outputs, you realize that it's still us as individuals that are helping to guide and determine what looks good or what we want to have as an output.
Exactly. Like something like this, creating it manually would take probably 20 times the amount of time it might have taken than going to a machine and like prompting it and making edits even to what has already been created.
Exactly, right. And so that's, I guess, what people call affordances in HCI. Like, what does the technology afford you? And as you rightly described, some of these things would take forever by hand. And so when it becomes so much faster to produce with a machine, then you can get into more complex shapes, you can get into more complex textures. Maybe you have more detail or more variations in color that you might not be able to achieve by hand.
No, very cool. One of the things that I remember always, sticking in from when I took some of these classes back in the day is that they always say like you want to solve the problem, the domain you're currently in. And so if you're solving a visual problem, you want to solve it visually. And if you're solving a logic problem, you want to represent that in a logical fashion. Somewhere along the way, we kind of like, lost track of that. And so I go back to like coding. There's no reason why someone should spend so much time writing between HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, three very different languages, when the output is something very visual. And if I want to center something on the screen, why am I not doing it in a more direct manipulation style way? Why am I actually writing bizarre lines in English or English like text, putting some numbers in when the output is visual? And that's where I think the AI tools have really like brought that whole thing full circle, because we've always had low code tools and no code tools, but the challenge with them is that you're always just bound by what their definition of done is, or their level of support for things. It's like a box that you really, if you were to break that box and go in, the tools no longer work. You make one minor change manually to the output, the round tripping where what's the final output and what the low code tool generated falls apart. Whereas with AI, that is completely, removed, which even its very primitive state, I'm very impressed with the output of these projects. And I can only imagine what happens in the future when we decide that programming is not going to be the traditional world of I'm writing some things in a text editor, waiting for a accomplish and build step. Instead, just like Midjourney, I'm going to describe what the output will be. The prompt engineering work will be more complicated, I guess, because I have to define more of the interactions, the states that need to be defined. Hopefully it won't be done in text. Hopefully it'll be done in more, maybe a slides format, maybe Figma, maybe it could even be just, framer visuals and like various scenes. So just upload that and it says, okay, I can see the transitions. I'm going to code it up. Doesn't matter anymore whether it's React or Tailwind or whatever framework. It's just going to be, here's the output, and that's what's going to be the thing we focus on.
Yeah, I think AI definitely provides a lot of adaptability, and I'm excited for us to be able to say, "Hey, I want this to be on the web. This is what it looks like. Now go." And you're not constrained by Webflow not having all the integrations, Framer charging you an extra $300 for for something else. Yeah, it'd be cool to have AI agents that can just execute for you.
Exactly, because the argument I always like make whenever I talk to people about who work in, at least in my space, which is like design tools, developer tools, and frameworks, is that nobody ever wakes up saying I can't wait to spend 8 hours a day writing code, or I want to spend all this time like clicking around doing things. Some people do, and I think and they will always have something that they'll always be able to enjoy doing, just like people enjoy creating art in more traditional forms, and so on. They'll be very successful at that. But if you look at the average, what is the most people looking for? It's like, I have a portfolio. I need to get up and running. I need to sell a product, like in your case, I need to sell something that I've created online. You probably don't want to fiddle with like what's a secure way to process credit card transaction? What is the regulations on what these policies are around the world? You just want to be taken care of. If you're using Stripe behind the scenes or any other service, you're like, yeah, at a certain level I might care, but at the end of the day, I don't really care as long as it's a good user experience and I have a very friction-free way of being able to conduct what I'm trying to do. And I think that's the other part where I think AI might become an interesting space.
Definitely, yeah. I think what also comes to mind is it becomes more on us to determine where we want to learn, right? Like, what areas do we want to spend time on when we're no longer required to spend the time learning something to get, say, a product out the door? We get a lot of freedom to choose, okay, well, am I going to spend 10 hours of my day today just learning how to do it because that's something I'm just genuinely curious about? So I'm interested in how people use their time in that world where AI can theoretically do anything for you.
Exactly. And there's always these arguments made around, especially in the educational community, on how important is it to learn the fundamentals of like something before you jump into tools that automatically do it for you. I was watching a documentary on, I believe it was like a very famous sushi maker, and he was talking about how he spent the first few years learning how to make the kind of the egg version of this for like day in and day out. Like they was never allowed to do anything beyond that. He just got a perfect before he was allowed to move on from his instructor
Mm.
on more other things. And it always struck me as an interesting concept because, he explained like the fundamental techniques that he perfected in making just that kind of an item end up translating into other areas where if you jumped directly into it, it would have been very difficult. And I always wonder how much is of what we're learning, and I spend a lot of time teaching developers how to do interesting things. I just enjoy learning things and sharing it. I wonder how much of what I'm doing and what people are doing today is even going to be relevant. Like, does it even matter at this point that what is HTML or like basic tags, or does it even matter? You know about how to do brushes and how to do like compositions in Photoshop or Illustrator. I always do question those things.
Ah, yeah, I guess we'll see, but I feel like the knowing at the very least the concept of what those things are can always be helpful, but it depends on the use case, right? Like you're saying, if they really don't plan on becoming a developer and they just want to sell their jewelry or accomplish something, it may not be relevant for them to know the details of. But yeah, it depends on their goals.
Yeah, it's I'm always reminded of an interesting story when I first joined, as a product manager on a team that was building a design tool. My first manager was, well known in the industry for having built design tools, and we always have endless debates on what does it mean for something to be a professional design tool. My view
Mm,
was that if someone is building something, they should be focusing entirely on the visual output. It doesn't matter what the underlying representation of it is going to be. His case was, of course, the counter. He said, for being a professional design tool, we don't expect the designer or the visual, implementer here to know the intricacies of the markup or what things are going to be generated behind the scenes, but they should be able to know the trade-offs between choosing this particular option for how you lay things out versus the other option for laying things out, because that might have implications on performance. It may have implications on how does the scaling work when you're on a larger screen versus a smaller screen. And those were always some interesting conversations where there never was a clear answer. It depends on what you're trying to do, but it also required someone who was purely visual to go one level deeper into technical concepts and
mm.
to be able to understand that. And then I often think back about it right now, where if we just describe it needs to be responsive, it needs to be performant, will the AI system automatically take care of it? And does it now mean that I never need to know some of these things? I'm curious to hear your take on something like that.
I have difficulty imagining us not having to intervene at all, where we really can trust it producing a good output, it's performant, and we move on with our lives. Like, at least in the visual realm, I still have this sense of like, okay, I want more control of what the output looks like or what the image looks like. And I think that's where it's helpful to understand the tools that you're using at some level, not like in hyper detail, but um, I think that helps in getting impressive visual images when you don't feel constrained by things that you don't know about, and things just like working for some reason and you don't know why. I think a good example of this is actually generative art, right? Like a lot of generative artists spend more time curating than they do actually making the artwork itself. And maybe that's the world that we go into with AI, where if you aren't interested in spending time with constraining the tools or manipulating the tools to create the output that you want, then you end up spending more time curating and just running that system over and over and again until you get hopefully the output that you want. But that just seems, in my mind, that just seems more wasteful in terms of time and a sense of like artistic pleasure, right? Like part of art is like your intention being there, at least for me. um and so I find it valuable to be able to have my hand in creating the output.
Exactly. It's often in case of like, it comes to cooking as well. And, like I enjoy cooking every now and then. And so for me, it's like, do I go with something that's like more, already made? Like where's the line there? Like, do I actually pick the tomatoes fresh from like a grocery store? Do I go to an actual farm or a garden and pick it? Or do I go from a can of tomatoes and then start from there? In many ways, it's like, what is your constraint right now? What are you trying to
Yes.
optimize for? And if you genuinely enjoy just spending time cooking, it's your way of like relaxing, then I'm
Yeah.
like, yeah, I'm willing to spend more time, like, not jumping to an intermediate step, but going more to the basic, even if the output for the most part will be indistinguishable from, like, me having done it versus me buying the can that already had the tomatoes seasoned.
Yeah, but I think knowing like, okay, I could cook this myself or I can just get it pre-done. I think that having that confidence is really valuable. Or like when I'm making things, I find it helpful to know, okay, if I don't like this output, I know I could just do it from scratch. Um, I think this is something that I've noticed a lot of Stanford students being good at, knowing when to take shortcuts. Maybe that will be a skill that really translates in the AI setting.
I mean, that's a skill I feel like it's beneficial in life in general. It's like when to, like, dive in and go into the details versus when to just either say, you know what, this is out of my league. I'm going to delegate to this service, this person, or this product. And I think it's a good one to have.
Yeah. Mm.
So let me zoom out a bit into Figma and see, like other areas that we want to dive into in the same time.
Um, we can go
So
into AI or yeah, or Midjourney here too if you want.
yeah, let's go to the Midjourney. Oh, these are fantastic. Let me zoom in.
Yeah, I mean
Okay, seeing here.
for people that haven't used Midjourney, I'm hoping that what we're seeing on the screen here can help conceptualize what it's doing. So if I just type in cat, it will well, it will produce four images of a realistic cat because that is what Midjourney has the most data points for. It's most familiar seeing a cat in a photorealistic form. Um, and if I, as the designer, am actually wanting a cat logo, I can add that in to the prompts to then guide it into a better direction because Midjourney doesn't know that when you say cat, you mean a logo and not a photorealistic image. And so on the right, you can see the progression of adding in more prompts, what that will get you. And then if you go down, you'll see what re-rolling does. Re-rolling is generating new versions of the same prompts. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it will actually create the cat logo that you had in mind. You can see on the far left, it went for a watercolor style instead of a photorealistic, just in case you were re-rolling for that look.
No, that is actually really cool because in so many creative, sectors, right? You're always, you get into a rut, often based on familiarity or what you've done, and so it's often like, at least what I do is like I have a collection of like design magazines I've been collecting over the years. I'm
Mm,
like stuck on, I need inspiration. I just go there, flip through it, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That gets me out of my rut, gets me thinking differently, and then I apply it to whatever I'm doing right now. Reroll seems like the much simplified version of it, where 80% of it might not be exactly what I'm looking for, but just seeing that might trigger something in my brain that causes me to want to do something different.
yeah, exactly. I mean, that's where Midjourney is really helpful for artists even today in its most primitive form. When you type in just a basic idea that you have and you yourself have a conception of what you want, it will give you different outputs. And sometimes you're like, well, actually, that's not bad. I don't mind that. And that those are really fun moments with AI tools.
Yeah. The gray area that I'm curious to get your take on is a lot of these visuals are based on other visuals, often ones
Mm,
that people might have created, yet I don't see any way of knowing which of the 80 people who created cat photos at some point are represented here. So,
yeah.
what do you think is the right solution?
Uh, what do I? That's a heavy. I mean, I think that is the question right now for artists in the space. There needs to be. I mean, you start to see solutions for text-based AI. For example, I think it was Bing. I know Neva also did this, where you cite the sources in the text. So
Yep.
whenever it gives output, it'll have a little footnote or attribution to say, "Hey, this was from XYZ website." And that's better than nothing, right? And right now in Midjourney for visuals, you have nothing. So it'd be great to just even have something like that where it might say, okay, with high probability, these are the artists. These are the top three artists that influenced this image. Because nothing's for certain with AI, right? Like it's never like it was 100% this person or rarely. Typically, it's like percentages. So if we could just have some sense of the weighting of influences that go into a visual, I think that could be a step forward.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. I always go back to like when you look at code, for example, there's a very good chance that someone wrote exactly what you did in some other form. Do we give them credit at this point or not? Like if I'm doing a simple loop, for example, and it comes out by the AI system, like, at what point do we decide like this is common general purpose thing that everybody knows versus this is very unique implementation that they
Mm.
probably need to give credit for? I think that also goes into the unknown territories that we're all trying to explore.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to think about it, like a threshold almost, right? Like I think we do that mentally with code, like you're describing. If you feel like a lot of your code is starting to look like something you read a couple of days ago, you kind of make the judgment to credit it. Maybe AI could do the same, right? If it's below the threshold of some arbitrary 50%, then it assumes that, hey, I'm the AI system that's mixing and mashing everything. I should get credit for being able to pull all these resources together in small fragments. And then if it's above that, then you have to put down who those artists are.
Yeah, I'm looking at these logos that have been generated here. These look really, really nice, almost as if like a real human being created them. Because I'm thinking about like back in the day when I had to create a logo, like
Yeah.
for example, the one with the mountain and the various colors behind it. I'm like, that would require me to go to a professional logo designer, go through multiple iterations. Whereas here, I'm like, oh, I see four variations of what I'm trying to do. They all look fantastic, and I'm sure if I just go back to Midjourney and like give more prompts, I'll get the output I want very, very quickly.
Yeah, okay, so this is where I fish. Like, to me, these are all bad. Like, I agree that it's good for AI. And maybe if we go back in time 5 years ago, 10 years ago, then this is amazing. But, like, I do not think that so to me, this is the equivalent of you going on Fiverr and hiring someone for $5 to make a logo. Like, in which case, this is great. This can replace it for cheap. But if you're looking for something slightly more developed, I think there's a long way for AI to go.
No, that is very fair. And I think it goes just to like when the web became more democratized, where anyone could create a web page and start uploading to whatever host they could. There was a gradient, higher quality content, had a very distinct look and feel. Lower quality design and content, kind of felt that way.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see the same proliferation of like a lot of content that goes through here. And then we're going to see like the ones that are truly good to get like, I think the power law applies in every sector. It's going to apply here as well. A few, percentage of individuals or organizations will create the things that we're like, wow, this is iconic. This is what we want to aim for.
Hmm.
And then everyone else will be able to. What does mean though is that more people who may not have the skills to create or design logos
Hmm.
will be able to create something good enough. I always go back to like, no fault of their own. When I was in school, the clip art on my school assignments was very noticeable for how bad it was. I can absolutely imagine my daughter's now, now 5 years old. I can imagine that as she goes through her education, teachers who may not have like the great artistic skills will probably have higher quality clip art, at least in my perception, than what was available because the ability to represent that in a more modern way will be easier than whatever came with whatever tool you were using back then.
Absolutely, yeah. I think for sure. I mean, having access to these kinds of tools is super powerful and definitely raises the bar for everyone. I now that I've seen the bar raised to this level, I'm just excited for the bar to be raised even higher, right? So I'm ready for AI to become something that professional designers can feel comfortable showing directly to a client.
Exactly. And I think the amount of skills you might have needed historically to be able to pull that off might be different than what you might need in the future where, I need to go to an advertising agency and spend many years to be able to do this, but it's going to be more of a, what creates the right output. And I do sometimes worry that there's always a premium that people charge for higher quality experiences. And so many industries are built around that premium
Mm.
being charged. If we make it easy for 80% of that premium to be created very quickly by anybody, will these industries survive on just a 20% being extra? Like how many clients will actually care that, I could pay X thousand dollars for this logo, or I can pay $10 for this one, and my target audience probably wouldn't know the difference between a logo design for this much and for this much. And that's an area where the speed at which so many industries are being, reconsidering like how are they going to operate in the future. I think that I haven't seen with other things in the past. Maybe electricity, but I wasn't alive for that when electricity first came out.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Um, Yeah, we can go to the other section if you want.
Yeah, I definitely talk about personalized UI because that to me is the one that's always very interesting. And I always spend a lot of time thinking about this because, when dark mode and light mode came around, we're like, oh, wow, that's like, new level of customization. But then we also know that different people have different preferences for how they interact with content, how they navigate and so on. Today, it's very much fixed, depending on, let's say you're visiting a typical application. That application has a style that's been defined by their style guide that's been defined over probably years and
Mm.
years of refinements from like usability studies and things like that. And we always know we're compromising. At the end of the day, we're designing for a happy medium, like a middle, group of people. There are going to be people on both extremes, of varying sizes, who will not find the UI or find the interface usable or approachable in a nice way. Where I find AI to be really exciting is that just like we're actually creating prompts to be able to generate things, that come as the output, we can maybe even dynamically generate content as part of a person's interactions that, let's say that I'm zoomed in at like, 200% or 300% like I am in Figma, right? Or actually I'm in 50% right now, but I was at like 200% earlier. Maybe all of my UI will adapt. This is almost like the intersection of like the work that's often done in like accessibility and these areas, but actually applying it more broadly to usability where even people who might prefer a certain style of how to navigate their application will now be able to have that represented in their app because it's not predefined, it's all fluid. The AI kind of a system determines what the appropriate positioning and layout and sizing of things are because before it had to be like you predefine X number of templates, you pick and choose maybe which one is more appropriate. Here, in a world where we can generate templates on the fly, there are no constraints in that anymore.
Yeah, I know a number of startups that are exploring this space, and actually, the use case you described for ads is a very lucrative one. Being able to show images and text on the fly to someone who has different preferences. We haven't been able to generate like photos on the fly like that before, and it would be really cool, maybe creepy, but really cool to do that. If I got a Shake Shack burger yesterday and I'm searching up like burger shops today, it'd be great for not just the Shake Shack ad to come up, but for it to be with like a California background, right? Like maybe with palm trees in the back because it knows that I'm in California and that's something visual, not just text based that they can play around with.
Exactly. Like if it knows, for example, that you tend to prefer a specific color scheme, like, or you specify like a specific theme, like let's say you're into music, for example, what if like all the web pages you visit happen to have like where there's like a header image where it's often like a generic image that is like specified of like, like whatever like all these various brands have, they were always themed to be music themed. Like you go to Instagram,
Mm.
the default banner in the background is of like, what you might like could be musical instruments, could be a picture of an orchestra, all these combinations. Imagine your entire experience of interacting with all of the interfaces, whether it is on your screen or on your like smart thermostat or all these various areas, is very hyper personalized to exactly what you like because it's all generated entirely on your preference.
Yeah. I think in some cases it's really cool to have that functionality and adaptability. In others, I do wonder like where does branding come in, right? Because one of the benefits of consistency is that people recognize or have a unified experience of what a company does and what their branding looks and feels like. And so to me that's kind of the tension. Do you want hyper personalization to give people like a really personalized touch, or do you as the person providing the platform or the service care more about how you're presented to the user?
They're spot on. There's always this tension there between, the first example I remember distinctly was there used to be a product called Winamp, which was like an MP3 player that you could use like locally on your machine to play music. And they had this idea of skins where you can actually personalize it on all these various formats. And I'm like, wow, there's like a very, it's very big into like, geometric kind of art, like, Mondrian kind of style. And so I had like a Winamp skin for exactly that's like, basically it was a little MP3 player was very much blocky in that sort. And
Mm.
then services like MySpace came out where the idea was when people are visiting your profile, it's really to see you and not the brand of MySpace itself. And so people personalize it in all kinds of, cool, often horrific ways as well, like black text, green blinking, backgrounds and marquees, all the stereotypes of like really bad design was what was done, but that was okay because that's what the person wanted to showcase about themselves. Whereas now you see like, Facebook and so on, there's very limited level of personalization. The content that you post can be different, but the interface is often displayed around is very varied. But I wonder how much the technology that limits that kind of customization, because can you imagine unit testing like 1 million variations and like
Yeah.
making sure that automation works, accessibility works, like all the various contrast guidelines you need to operate around the world, all these things work, no longer matter because the system will automatically generate it. I wonder if that might unlock some interesting layers of creativity.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think you'll have just like how the internet provided so much more data and so much more information. I think the same will happen with AI tools. Like you just get overwhelmed by the number of the number of possibilities. And I think in our example for making ads more personalized or platforms more personalized, it really is about curation and monitoring. Maybe that becomes what's important. If AI can generate a bunch of different options, maybe the human comes in and has to approve or adjust what looks good versus doesn't, rather than creating the actual artifacts.
Absolutely. And I think some industries will be more readily willing to accept and investigate some of these things, and others might be more tricky to. I'm always imagine like, we think of like the typical acronyms like B2B and B2C and consumer products and so on. I think consumer products will absolutely benefit from like giving this personalization. Whereas I can often imagine like more traditional like B2B kind of products where you might have someone going like, I'm logging into my bank, I can't find the submit button anymore. What's going on? You hope that the tech support person on the other side can replicate your version of the app in a way that is repeatable, because for a lot of these organizations, every time that you're stuck doing something is a huge loss. Like I can't imagine like Bank of America, for example, giving each person a very dynamic UI, knowing that there's no way to reproduce it, and mistakes in areas could be hugely, bad, where, you might wire the money to the wrong person, or, the UI for wiring is like going out as opposed to in, and like little things like that, where consistency might be the right thing. And that's going to be a tricky area to navigate as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, I can't imagine like the customer support people. They'll be pulling their hair trying to work around these kinds of tools.
Well, Chloe, it's been fantastic talking to you about this. Like this, to those who are actually listening and not watching it, I encourage you to watch it, because this is one of those like interactive kind of things where there's a great Figma file that Chloe created with all the various things to navigate through and kind of add visuals to the conversation that we're also having. And so before we wrap up, you're currently, studying HCI. What is your long-term goal? What is, you had to think about what would your ideal, life and career be like, 10 years from now that you work in this area. What do you think it's going to look like?
I mean, I love startups. I think if I can work on a startup that's in this intersection, thinking about design and visual questions with technology, that's the sweet spot for me.
Perfect. Chloe, thank you so much. I'll talk to you in a bit.